Okay, we're going to talk about discontinuous change. But let's start by talking about two kinds of change: continuous or incremental change, and then discontinuous, which is very abrupt change. So what do when we say continual change, what are we talking about? Well, continual change really implies kind of a continuity, things that sort of stretch out over time in a fairly predictable manner. They're incremental changes. They're not really drastic. They're kind of building block changes. And so you have, when there's in this kind of continual change, you have sort of expectations that, things will change, but they're going to change in a fairly predictable fashion. Uh, in our own lives, we'll say, putting the work in. I put the work in and I got the results that I expected, right? So, there's lots of examples of this in nature and in our lives. A child is born and we sort of predict, what size they're going to be, you look at a 5-year-old and he's, 4.5 feet tall. You say, wow, what a huge kid. He's really he's outside of the expectations in terms of his size, because we have kind of a sense of how physical growth takes place. We don't expect a 10-year-old to be, 6 feet tall, or 1 foot tall. We kind of have this sense of how physical growth takes place. And that's the case. We look at a tree or a flower, and we have kind of a sense of how that incremental change is taking place. We have it in kind of intellectual skills. We see, I worked all year on my vocabulary, and I had a 5,000 word vocabulary, and at the end of the year I had a 7,000 or 8,000 word vocabulary. So that's it. Every week that I worked on it, I got better. People take language courses, and at first they can't pronounce any of the words in another language, and at the end of a few months they're speaking sentences. That's the kind of incremental change that we expect when we work at something and we get better. Our skills improve as we go along. Well, and we're told, a lot of time, put in the work. If you work hard, you're going to see these improvements. You can predict these improvements, right? Well, what does discontinuous change look like? Well, that's when those expectations that you have are really kind of go sideways. And we have some examples. If you hold up a block of ice and you put a candle under it, or some kind of a heat source, it doesn't appear like anything is happening at all. And then after a while, water starts, the ice begins to melt and turns into water. Well, that's a discontinuous change in the sense of you might run over and say, well, this one isn't melting, and go to another one, and go to another one, and go to another one, and nothing would ever happen because you haven't waited long enough for the discontinuous change. You put water in a kettle, and you wait for however long it is before the water boils, and when it boils, what happens? Steam. That's a discontinuous change. It's changed from one form to another. Water and steam behave quite differently. But all of a sudden you put the energy in, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's this shift. This discontinuous change. An earthquake, okay? Maybe something that's going on for centuries under the earth. Things are changing that we can't see, and all of a sudden, boom, have this huge earthquake. That is definitely an abrupt change, which is startling and disruptive. Probably 15 years or so ago, I can't remember the exact date, but in Asia there was this gigantic tsunami that wiped out about 250,000 people in just hours. 9/11 was certainly a discontinuous change in our country. We lived in a country which we never really had a major attack on our country. And like so many other countries have had. And here we had this dramatic event which really changed Homeland Security. You couldn't go on the plane anymore, unless you went through this very rigorous procedure at the airport. A lot of things changed in this country, including our thinking about vulnerability. We got very paranoid about terrorism and so forth and so on, even though, frankly, most of the terrorism that's occurred in this country has been our own citizens, white supremacists. COVID-19 is an example of a discontinuous change. All of a sudden, the world changed, okay? Although there were some people who, by denying it, hoped that it didn't exist or something like that. It changed our country. It very, very, very dramatically. Actually changed the world very, very dramatically, very suddenly, and it was not our expectation at all, even though we'd had a lot of scientists telling us over years that this was quite possible. Climate change is occurring in kind of an incremental way, but it's speeding up. And what the fear is that there's a tipping point. And at that tipping point, things will shift dramatically and radically, and we won't be able to get the genie back in the box again, okay? That we will be unable to kind of control or ameliorate climate change. It'll just kind of go off the rails. So another way of language for discontinuous change, people say a tipping point, where you're going along incrementally, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's this dramatic change that's unexpected, breaks the pattern, and changes everything. We've used the term on a previous video we did, a paradigm shift. It's another way of describing a discontinuous change, where all of a sudden, like for thousands of years, people thought of the earth as the center of the universe. Then all of a sudden, that paradigm flipped due to Galileo and some other folks. And that became, to say that today would be, what's the matter? It's like the flat earth versus the globe. I mean, that was another paradigm shift, where you're one day it seems perfectly fine to think that there's an edge of the earth that you might fall off of, like the old map show, and a year later, no one thinks that way, So what does that mean for us? We know that there is what they call a time and treatment effect, that it's really been researched all over the world. The longer people stay in treatment or in a therapeutic community or something like that, the better their outcomes are lifelong. So that's what that would be an incremental or a continuous change effect. So you really see this incremental change. But we know that that's not all of it. You know, because if people just stay at Amity, but they really don't participate, they don't engage, they don't work very hard at it, that even if they stayed quite a long time, it does not guarantee they're going to do great when they leave, because they really haven't engaged. So it would be kind of like if you went to a university but you didn't go to class, okay? Just by being there, not being on campus doesn't really get it. You have to actually study and engage and work to get that time effect. But there's also the discontinuous change that is also critical. We know that there are tipping points, that there are points where it seems like with the block of ice, you're putting in all this work and nothing is really happening. And then, and some people, you know, they've really worked hard, but they say, well, nothing's really happening, and they quit. But they may have been only a week or a month or, you know, away from the discontinuous change, where all of a sudden the box flipped or the tipping point occurred, and they really had this kind of consolidation of all the experience that they've had. And we see that over and over again. I mean, I've been doing this for over 50 years, and I know so many people I've talked to, and I say to them, this is, you know, maybe months or years after they've been at Amity or at another similar kind of organization. What was the tipping point? What was the time when all of a sudden things really fell into place for you? And they all invariably have one or two of those, where they have, there's words for it, an epiphany, a peak experience, a tipping point, a personal paradigm shift, whatever term you want to use. So let's look at some brief video clips of people who've come through Amity who have had this experience of both the incremental changes over time and these discontinuous tipping points in their lives. So you get kind of a picture of different people, but having that same kind of experience.
You know, I had heard lots of stories about men being raped and women being raped, and I've been raped, you know, about at least 4 times, you know, in an awful ways. And I could never ever begin to think that I would actually share that with anybody. And this retreat was like, I felt like I could just say anything. Whereas before, the other retreats I've been in, I still kind of felt like I would kind of be hesitant in saying some of these things, you know, without thinking that people were going to kind of look down on me and kind of look at me in a different way. And I think that when the honesty level went up in this retreat, so did the trust, and, you know, kind of everything that, you know, kind of good stuff that goes along with that, you know. When people started to get to be really honest, you know, you could feel that people could actually, you could feel the trust, you know, around the room. The whole atmosphere just kind of, you know, shifted into like a really good way. And I even at one point felt like I was consumed with this big safety net, with this big old safety blanket that just kind of fell on me. And I had never ever in my life felt that much safety in my life. And I think it's really important for me to when I listen to other people's story, especially to men, is because I've always disliked men. You know, I used to really, I had a lot of hatred for men. And now it's like I'm just really grateful that actually I love men now in a good way. I have a lot of, you know, good friendships with men, which I never thought would ever be possible.
There was a number of moments. from various people, making it safe for me to be vulnerable, making it safe for me to see the good. There is good in me. I just had to put work in, internal work. And I think if there was a moment, it was the moment that I sat in a workshop group with Mary Stanton, who's no longer with us, in what do you call it? What was she doing? Mindful meditation workshop. And I couldn't believe how at peace this woman, I could feel she was so at peace with, while having terminal cancer and being blind in one eye. I never saw her complain, never heard her complain. But the moment she reached out, at the end of a group, she reached out her hand to me like she wanted me to let her take my hand, and she promised me, she says, I will not hurt you. And I believed her. And at that moment, I believed that, that's when I started realizing that amnesia don't go to bed at nighttime trying to think of ways to hurt me. This stuff is designed to work. And you don't have to do it by yourself. Just allow people to help you. Just been there.
When I came back and I got my emotions, my learning experiences, and I had to sit on the pew and reflect and remembering everything that I have learned being with Amity all these, couple of years, and I really wasn't serious about it until this last fall, my last relapse. And like it was time for me to grow up and get serious about my life, about my work, and really start utilizing what I've learned and not play around too much, just basically grow up. And I knew I couldn't waste any more of my time, and that it was just a serious matter of life or death,
Would be when I was around Amity at 9 months, and I quit looking at Amity as a drug program, and I started acting as if it was my home, and I started to do all my behaviors from that perspective, that this was my home, I was going to protect it, I was going to take care of it, I was going to be a proprietor. I relieved a lot of stress, and it allowed me to become closer to people. Instead of always thinking that I'm in a program and it was a we, they.
I can, because, I can just tell you, it was hard for me at first because it took me well over my first year. Then I didn't believe this, people were running around here smiling. They say this thing is designed to work. And I was the one holding myself to the belief of my past that I would never change. And people took care of me. People showed me instead of just telling me how to do this. And that was the key for me. I watched men and women various demonstrators show me how they deal with life when life show up and it's not always good. And show me that I can learn how to forgive myself. I think that was one of the biggest keys in my whole process to this day, is learning how to forgive myself, not letting my past hold me hostage.
And I just think it's really important for people to understand that you need the time, and probably the most common error for people at Amity and other places like Amity is they've stopped using drugs, they're sleeping well, they're eating well, maybe they're exercising, and they feel better. And they think, okay, I've got it now. But they don't. They're just feeling better, okay? Because they're living a much more reasonable kind of life. But they really haven't had the incremental experience over time that's going to build the base for change, for permanent change in their lives. Feeling better doesn't necessarily mean you've done that. You just feel better. And so they then say, well, I'm done, and I'm out of here, and see you later. And the next thing we know, they've overdosed, or they've relapsed, or or things have not worked out well because they didn't give the time, okay? At the same time, so it's important for people to understand this dynamic that you've got to put in the time, the incremental period of time. We know that 90 days is the threshold of change, that under 90 days, scientifically speaking, rarely does anything really happen. Beyond 90 days, every month will improve the potential outcomes. A year is really a great marker, you know, if you can do that. But we also, so first, know if you want the results out of this, you need to put in the time and the effort. But secondly, you have to recognize that there will be periods of time when you've really worked hard, you've done everything right, and it feels like you're stuck. You aren't stuck. It's the next thing that will happen is the discontinuous change, where you really, all the results sort of appear at the same time, and you have this real tipping point in your life. So don't be discouraged if you've committed yourself to really putting in the time, taking the time that we know it takes to build that basis for real change in your life, for that transformational process where you really have an identity change and you come away, you move on as a different person with a different identity. So you've got to do that. Once you've made that commitment, that's great. But then don't get discouraged because it feels like you have these plateaus, you know, or just go on forever and you're working hard, you're doing everything, and nothing appears to be happening. It's happening. It is happening. It just is, you have to wait for that moment, for that epiphany, for that realization, for that paradigm shift, for that discontinuous change, which will happen. It's inevitable. It will happen. So don't get discouraged and quit before it happens. Probably the saddest thing is somebody who's maybe a month away from this incredible change and stopped before they got there. You know, that's sad and unnecessary. So I hope that's helpful to all of you who are engaged in this process of change.